Hello, and welcome to the Bible and Beyond podcast from Early Christian Texts. We explore historical and spiritual questions about Jesus, gender, women, salvation, healing, and the meaning of life. Shirley Paulson is hosting a series of conversations with scholars who are able to unlock mysteries from extra-canonical books, forgotten scriptures, so-called Gnostic Gospels, and the Bible. Thanks to a generous AAR, Loose Advancing Public Scholarship grant, we are now offering a completely free online course titled Introducing Nag Hammadi and Related Texts. In 24 video lectures, you'll gain a fundamental understanding of recently discovered texts written by early Jesus followers. Just visit bibleandbeyond.courses to enroll. And now, here's Shirley Paulson.
This is a fun new way to explore some Bible and Beyond issues today. We're going to look at a very critical time in the history of Christian development, but with the aid of a historical novel that gets us emotionally involved in the story. So to do so, let me introduce Dr. Ward Sanford. Before becoming a novelist, he was a highly respected scientist with the U.S. Geological Survey. And now retired from that world, he's turned his focus to the subject of the first century Judea and early Christian themes. His goal is to bridge the gap between biblical and historical study and compelling narrative fiction. So the book we're talking about today is titled Cry for Jerusalem. So welcome, Ward. It's great to get to talk to you about this.
Thank you, Shirley. Thank you for having me. I always enjoy discussing this. So.
Yeah, great. Well, I have to say that the story is quite compelling. The actual history of this takes place in the years between 63 and 66. So before we get into your story, maybe you could tell us some of the context of what was actually happening in Jerusalem and Rome in those critical years before we get into the human part of this. Just give us a little background.
Right, as you say, the first book is 63 to 66, and the continuing three books go all the way up through 70 in the destruction of Jerusalem. So, yeah, this is the close. Just follows the close of the New Testament writings, and so we're picking up where the New Testament leaves off and describing the very dramatic years that followed up through the year 70. Rome was coming down harder and harder on Judea, and a rebellion started that lasted from 66 to 70, and ended in a dramatic confrontation that really changed Western world history.
Yeah, it sure did. All right, so the basic issue then is the tension is growing between Rome and Jerusalem. So, but you tell the story in such a gripping way with people who, I mean, these are fictional characters, some of them, but some of them are also quite real, but they have feelings of fear and pride and attraction.
Love and that kind of thing,
Yeah,
right?
it really is easy to find ourselves in your story with these characters. Maybe could you give us a brief overview of the storyline as you set it up, and then tell us why this particular story is compelling to tell it as you did? Let's just go there.
So this work is based on the writings of Flavius Josephus, the historian, who people have heard the name, and I'd heard the name, but when I started reading his material, especially the book called The Jewish Wars, I was amazed to find out he was not just a historian, he was intimately involved in the conflict and everything going on there. So he has a bird's eye eyewitness view and writes so many compelling details and stories and drama and complexity of everything going on. I just couldn't believe I'd never heard these stories before. And then when you try to read his book, though, it's like reading 3 centuries old English translation of the Greek, right? So it's quite challenging to wade through. But I managed to find a modern English translation. When I started reading that, that's when I really got excited about the stories, and then realized, well, maybe if somebody put these into novel form, people would really be attracted and interesting. And from the historical novels I've read, you kind of learn about history along the way, right? And you're following characters that are very real and compelling. So we were able to take a lot of characters right out of his history and add two or three more to really fill out the whole story and get a lot of people interested in the whole series.
And do you think, could you, I don't know if it's possible, but could you sort of tell us the story of this particular book, Cry for Jerusalem? Like what's Josephus doing and where does he go?
Sure,
And
the basic plot
yeah,
line.
yeah,
Yeah,
the
so
plot line, yeah.
I would say there's five main characters, Josephus being one of them, going by the name of Joseph through the whole series. Uh, the first part he actually writes is true. He went to Rome to try to free some Jewish priests who had been taken captive there. So that's part of how the plot line all begins, and we follow the main history points. He meets some of the other main characters along the way. He gets introduced to Nero, who's the emperor at the time. Then it turns out one of the main female characters he meets, who's a Roman woman, is engaged to be married to Nero's new tax collector, who's going to be governor of Judea, who's a real person. Both of these people, you can Google them. They're actually mentioned by Josephus. So this new governor of Judea, Gessius Florus, he's the antagonist of the whole series because he goes to there to help to raise taxes, and basically his first goal is to raid the Jewish temple of its gold, and but fails. And this is what really starts off the whole rebellion in 66. And then we follow everything that happens after that. Nero sends in General Vespasian with 4 more legions. They first attack Galilee, and Josephus, being fluent in Latin and have been to Rome, he's put in charge of defending Galilee because he knows Roman military tactics and things, but he's captured there by the Romans. But instead of being put to death, he sort of almost kind of befriends the Roman emperor, and he's kept in captivity for the next few years, and then sort of sees himself as a self-appointed liaison to the Romans to try to convince the Jews to surrender, because otherwise these legions are going to destroy your city and the temple. So let's be real here. Let's be realistic. But of course, the rebels aren't going to surrender. So, of course, he fails in that mission. And then, having been with the Romans, the Jews basically see him as a traitor. Well, you've basically gone under the Romans and are giving him all kinds of secrets. And so, for centuries, Josephus has been one of the a huge seen as a traitor, to the Jews. But on the other hand, he goes to Rome and writes down all this incredible amount of history of the Jews, and gives them this wonderful gift of having recorded all the history that took place through the whole time period, not just that period. So.
What a fascinating character. And you're right, you bring out the drama beautifully along with the characters in the story. So it does really come alive beautifully in your story. What would you say are the issues that brought the tension in Jerusalem to a climax? I mean, what came together that made it just get so terrible?
Well, so Josephus tells us there were a series of Roman governors that just became more and more harsh after Felix and Festus, who are mentioned in Acts. Then comes another governor named Albinus. He said was even harsher on the Jews, more taxes. And then finally, the straw that broke the camel's back was Gessius Florus coming in and actually attacking Jerusalem to try to raid the temple of its gold. And the rebels decided they'd had enough, and they were underestimated. There were thousands of them that managed to actually defeat the first Roman legion that was sent to try to capture Jerusalem. They ambushed them in a retreat and actually stole their eagle, which was very humiliating to the Romans, right? So it was, yeah, that part of the history, I'd never even have heard of before, so.
No. Well, there's just so much building up at that time. We don't really realize that when we're reading the Bible, and then the disciples go off and evangelize and all that, and we don't realize all the tension.
Or the fact that there was this is the big fire in Rome that you see Nero playing the violin or those kind of things. But that was the big fire in Rome, and so the Rome itself was running out of money drastically, and so he was sending out tax collectors, everybody, to try to milk as much as they could out of the local populaces, including Judea. So that interesting that event that happened in Rome, carried all the way to Judea. So
And so you're talking about a real fire, right?
yes,
Yeah.
that's real historical fire that occurred in Rome in the summer of '64 that burned down half the city. Yeah.
Which would be significant since Rome was such an advanced, civilized kind of place with all kinds of things going on, lots of people, lots of things going on. So that was a big deal. Well, you've mentioned that they were taxing everybody, but it feels like Nero was really angry at the Judean province in particular. And maybe I'm reading this into your story, but do you think it was their Jewishness, or what is something about the territory, or what was it that provoked him with Judea?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Well, it is known even from the Roman historians that suggesting that Nero actually might have started the fire, but he certainly blamed the Christians on the fire, and they knew that Judea was the source of what they called this superstition. So whether that had anything to do with it, I think it was simply more the governor he chose was a very ambitious and ruthless man after not only gold for Nero, but but probably siphoning some off for himself. The governors of the provinces at those times would enrich themselves by keeping half the taxes that they levied. So.
All right, so we are going to just take a little break for a moment here, and we'll be right back to talk about the intra-Jewish struggles and their connection to the Roman problem. So just hang on a little bit. We'll be right back.
If you enjoy our Bible and Beyond podcasts, we hope you'll consider becoming a sponsor by joining our Patreon community. Your affordable monthly contribution entitles you to exclusive content, discounts on our live online hybrid courses, Bible and Beyond gear, and invitations to online get-togethers with other supporters. Go to patreon.com/Bible and Beyond to join at a level that's right for you.
You bring out such an important element of the Jewish world at this time, that there were so many desperate ways of approaching the Romans. And even within the family setting in the story that you have, this one family is just so torn apart by all these things, as you illustrate with the story with Joseph. Do you think that their strong opposition to each other ultimately just made them too weak to oppose Rome? Or do you think Rome was just going to win anyway?
Well, absolutely, the internal conflicts contributed to their losses. So yeah, there were sects. I don't know if you call them religious sects, more political and class divisions there, because the upper class, what they would consider the moderate Jews, they were all about just coexisting with Rome, because they knew Rome was powerful and could smash them with their thumb anytime they wanted to. So they were just trying to coexist with Rome. But the lower classes were feeling all of the economic suffering from the taxes, so they started really disliking the upper middle class, who they just started seeing as Roman collaborators, right? And so this is how the lower rebellious classes started. There was even this group of assassins called the Sicarii, which we investigate some that they would try to go out and kill the Roman collaborators, right? So there was definitely class tension going on at the time. And then once they took over, and the rebels did manage to kick them out, there were two big rebel factions. One of the rebel leaders' name was John of Gachala. He was from the north. He had all the Galileans following him. Well, they came to Jerusalem, but also there was another rebel leader named Simon Bar Giora, and he led the other faction of the Judeans. So you had these two large rebel factions, and then you had the moderates, and they all ended up in Jerusalem. Once Vespasian came and started attacking from the outside in, they all ended up going to Jerusalem, which was the largest fortress city. And then they started battling each other. So they had the whole city split up, and they were fighting each other. The city was divided in two. They were shooting at each other, and the worst part of it is, and this led up right to the year 70. Instead of realizing the Romans are going to end up surrounding you and uniting, they were still fighting, and each had their own food supply, and they burned each other's food supplies to try to get rid of the other opposing rebel force. And just soon after they did that, the Romans showed up and laid a siege on Jerusalem, and now they don't have their food supply. And so this led to enormous famine in the city during the siege. I mean, Josephus writes that 1 million people died in the famine. This is part of the reason for the title cry for Jerusalem. It was just horrible, right? So all of that internal fighting weakened them substantially before the Romans arrived.
What a sad story. I mean, and clearly they didn't want to attack each other when they were just desperately trying to fight off Rome. Yeah.
Right. And once the Romans arrived, they united, but it was too late. They wounded each other too much before the Romans arrived. So
Well, all stories need to have some kind of romance to keep the heart beating.
yes.
And you do keep your readers hungry for more, I have to say. Are there any parts of the various romantic moments that had any historic truth, or was that all your wonderful imagination?
No, I can't probably say there was too much historic truth in that. I have to say I've probably been inspired by movies I've seen over the years, and almost like scenes probably you could think of, like, I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Braveheart, but like there's romance between William Wallace, right, and the French Queen, and she visits him in prison, and we have like a scene similar to that, right? So there's these what do you call them, romances that aren't
Oh, unrequited romance?
unrequited romances that are happening at a distance. There's, yeah, so, and this is true that at this time the thing started, Josephus already had a wife who died. So he was a widower when it starts. He had another girl who he was they sort of secretly had commitments to, but then when he had to leave for a while, she ended up being pledged to somebody else. So now he's got this former girlfriend, Leah, who's already married, but they still have feelings for each other. So right, and then we've got our main Roman soldier character who's friends with these folks, and he starts getting eyes for our Roman lady Cleo, who was married to the governor, but he was very abusive, right? And she has to escape from her husband because of the abuse that's going on. So we've got, right, some almost um, triangular love stories going on, and right. I can also say I was probably inspired. I don't know if you've ever seen um, War and Peace. I saw the British TV version that came out back in the 70s or 80s or something. And there's a lot of romance going on in there between all the different characters, and some very scenes like that. And in the end, some of the people you thought were going to get together don't end up getting together. So our series sort of has that flavor to it too. Maybe some of the obvious connections don't end up being the people who end up getting together in the end, but that's kind of the fun of the whole thing, right? So,
Right. Well, you do a beautiful job of keeping the story moving with the heartbeats of the characters, and so, and then you feel the drama of the history all interwoven quite well. Nice job with that. One of the elements of the story that struck me as historically quite accurate was your portrayal of the royal power. The emperor, which we do have more information about the wealthy, powerful people than we do the poor people, but the emperor, was not only a decision maker, but he had a firm grip on power over everybody who reported to him. Do you think that this supreme effort to create and maintain absolute authority and power is what actually became the impetus behind this ultimate force against the Judeans? What do you think about that?
well, yeah, I mean, the emperor would certainly feel like he had to keep control of all the provinces, right? He's certainly not going to let any of the provinces simply escape the thumb and the taxation of the Romans. So certainly when Judea expelled the Romans, that was never going to stand under a Roman emperor, right?
Well, I like the way you sort of make very clear the way the pater familias works in that Roman system, where there's somebody at the top and everybody has to fall in line in some way, and that there are people who have power over others, but ultimately,
Yeah, even our main character, Cleo, who's the Roman noble woman, basically is assigned to marriage. She doesn't have a choice. Her father decides who she's going to marry, and that's just basically she has to go along with it, right? So
yeah. Uh, why? I was curious when I got to the end of the story, which is again quite a wonderful novel. The book is like 400 pages, so it's quite a
yeah, the first
story.
one's 400. The last one's like 700. So
Oh,
that's a long
okay.
series.
All right. Well, I was wondering when I got to the end of that, why did you stop at the year 66? So,
Now it continues. Yep.
yeah, all right. Because that in 66, you feel like it's about to burst into some other
Yeah, yeah.
bigger crisis. Yeah, yeah. All right. So let's go back to the internal issues going on there. You had included some, I don't know, maybe brief references to Paul and Peter, who were specific followers of Jesus. Did you think of the followers of Jesus making any real difference in the story, or were they just kind of side characters in all this?
Yeah, my whole one of my underlying ideas behind the novel series is not to make it like pro-Christian or pro-Jewish, but have a wide, sort of a neutral stance to have it attractive to a wide audience, right? So, but on the other hand, the Christians are there, and to ignore them really isn't to write accurate history. So, for example, in book two, our main Roman uh, character, ends up going to Rome and becoming one of the Praetorian guards, and gets assigned prison duty, and lo and behold runs into Paul, who's in prison at the time. And that I kind of put that after realizing that the time period, that is exactly when the time Paul is in prison. So to have this encounter would certainly be a really historical thing to include in the novels, right? And so there are other Christians that they sort of run into and have a few discussions with. Certainly the Jews at the time are aware of this sect of Christians that they call the Nazarenes, right? That are following this Jesus of Nazareth, who they're certainly aware of, right? But themselves not following.
And I'm just kind of curious that I appreciate the fact that you're not trying to make it sound like it's leaning one way or the other, but it felt like it's real, and I think this is historically true that it felt like really it's a Jewish story here.
It's
And
certainly a Jewish story, yes.
yeah, and the followers of Jesus are doing their own thing, but they're not
Right.
necessarily. Uh,
They're having enough problem in their conflicts with Rome rather than still any remnant conflicts with the Jews at the time, right? So the Jews, especially probably the Pharisees and things, didn't like this new sect. They disagreed with them. But in terms of real danger and conflict, that was coming from Rome. Under Nero, there was a persecution and things. So
which of these factions or sects or whatever you want to call them do you feel really had the most power in the struggle among the Jews?
well, and so Josephus clearly gives us some good descriptions of at least the religious sects, like the Pharisees and the Sadducees, who are more involved with the being the priests in the temples, and the Essenes. So he gives a few pages descriptions of how what each of these factions were. I'm not sure any one of them. Probably the Essenes were more sympathetic to the Christians. They sort of didn't like what was going on in the temple and with the other people in charge anyway. So, but the Pharisees and Sadducees certainly had disagreements, strong disagreements with the Christians.
Yeah, and among each other, just aside from the Jesus followers, who do you think was the most powerful? Do you think the like the military people or the peacemaking people, or who had the most power in this struggle here?
You mean within the city itself or
Well, I mean,
in
among
Judea?
all the different Jewish factions of those different
Yeah,
factions.
they still had the Sanhedrin, and that was really kind of the governing slash religious body that really had the most control over thing. And I think there were Pharisees and Sadducees in the Sanhedrin. So although these two sects saw themselves differently, they still were collaborating really in a more general sense.
And then maybe you could put Josephus in the context of these.
Yeah, well, just Josephus was certainly upper class. He would have been educated, fluent in Latin and Greek, as well as Aramaic and Hebrew, so very well educated. It's hard to imagine. But yeah, he actually says in his autobiography, he spent time with the Pharisees um, for a number of years, learning whatever they had to teach. So he might have had a leaning in that direction, but didn't follow officially to become one of the Pharisees,
But he knew the
right?
Essenes pretty well too, didn't he?
He knew them all well enough that he could really describe what they all believed and thought in detail, right?
Right. So I'm curious about how you read his changeover from being such a strong. I'm coming from a Jewish family, very Jewish, and then feeling like he's really supporting Rome. Like,
Yeah, what happened?
yeah, what happened? How'd that happen?
Well, he did go to Rome and encountered Romans and saw the grandeur of Rome, and you can tell from his writings. He even says that he thinks that God allowed Rome to build its civilizations, and so to go against Rome was to go against like, what would you say, the way that God allowed things to develop. And so yeah, he's still in his own mind very pro-Jewish, but saw Rome as a power that God allowed to exist. And so to defy Rome was to defy the order that God had actually set up for the world.
What I think is so interesting about that is that I just don't really think of Jews as acknowledging that their God was governing other people because
No, they were very independent. They would not say that, but for example, in order to satisfy Rome, they actually offered sacrifices in their temple for the Roman emperor, right? Because I think the other societies were maybe a little more, well, they were more polytheistic, but to show that the Jews were not enemies of them, they allowed them these kind of sacrifices. And one of the things the Jews did that angered the Romans is they stopped those sacrifices for the emperor. And that was like, well, that's really a sign of hostility towards us. So if you're not doing that, right? So
wow, okay. Okay, well, fascinating story, fascinating history, fascinating reality. And, it's interesting to kind of use the word fiction here because I think the main thing is that what you're doing is you're adding flesh and blood to some really important history.
right. I struggle with the word fiction because people hear that and say, well, it was all made up anyway, when in reality, we're taking a whole lot of history and adding a bit of like flesh and blood to it so that it becomes very readable, right? So
It is readable. You do a really nice job of keeping the story moving. And I recommend people who really want to learn that story. It's a great way to do it.
yeah, well, I think I was also influenced by reading a couple of Dan Brown's novels,
Yeah,
because he keeps it moving and he has very short chapters. So one of our goals was to keep short chapters and keep it moving.
it does
So,
move. Yeah. Let me ask you this then. What do you hope people will take away from the story besides experiencing a gripping historical novel? Like, are there any particular lessons or issues that would help people understand our own lives better today? Like, what's this about?
okay, so maybe 2 points there. First is I just hope they just walk away saying, "Wow, I learned a whole lot of history
Okay.
I never knew before,"
Yeah.
because
Yeah. It's there.
that's what I love about historical fiction. The second thing is I see these two rebel factions fighting each other internally before the real enemy shows up. And I almost see that happening in our country today. We're so divided. We're fighting each other instead of realizing that we're not the enemy, right? We should keep our guard against who the real enemy is. So.
I have to say that on that point is so interesting. The way your story shows the family having conversations together and wanting to be family and yet struggling with their differences, right there within
Yeah,
the family.
even that, right?
Yeah, which
Yes,
does resonate with us today. How do you stay together with your common interest when you're struggling so hard against this enemy and you have different ways of doing it?
right. And even their different members of their family had different political views. And how do you stay unified?
Well, all right, Ward, I want to thank you so much for this conversation. I think that you've moved us into a part of the history that not many people know about, but it's really critical to our understanding of how religion was evolving in that first century. So it's such an important time. So thank you so much for being with us on Bible and Beyond today.
Well, thank you for having me, Shirley. It's been fun.
Thank you.
Thank you, listeners, for being with us today. Be sure to check out the details from this episode by accessing the show notes on our website, earlychristiantext.com/podcasts. Or just come browse around the website to find loads of other content, including blog posts, articles, online courses, our monthly discussion series, and more. We hope you'll consider supporting the work of producing online resources related to the incredible records left behind by the earliest followers of Jesus. You can become a supporting member by joining our Patreon community at patreon.com/Bible and Beyond. We love hearing from you on social media. Find us on Facebook, X, and YouTube by searching for Early Christian Texts. We'll catch you on our next episode of the Bible and Beyond podcast.